You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Monday evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is me, Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on Odyssey Radio Network. And to listen to the audio stream, all you have to do is go to odysy1.com and listen to the audio that goes out broadcast to the radio stations and all of our fine internet affiliates. And you can come over to the YouTube stream to see the video version of this. And sometimes, it's what's so great about watching me talk. Sometimes I have some pretty pictures, sometimes it's fun that way. But the greatest benefit over there is to join the live chat room, which is going on during the show when it airs. So come on over to the simulcast at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the chat room of Intrepids for this program. All right, folks, we have been talking around a lot of things, and since, when I do the Situation Room with Rocky, we've got each other to bounce off of, and so we do a lot of frivolity and a lot of fun. Junk that sometimes isn't even related to what we're talking about as a topic for the evening. But in this show, it's just me. And so I like to just jump into the material, and hopefully it's something that's going to hold your interest, and you're going to find something in there that is beneficial to you. If nothing else, you can come over and talk about it in the chat room, and we'll get your views in as well. One of these days, I'll be set up to take calls, and we'll do some shows like that. Oh, and another thing I want to do is I'm probably going to do some shows where I do some tarot readings. Now, they probably will not air in the normal time, but it will be an extension put on via live video over at my YouTube channel. So watch for some announcements for that. I'm also thinking of, depending on the day and the topic and what I feel like at the time, doing some live extensions after the broadcast ends. And you can find those over at my YouTube channel. I'll announce them, and I'll announce it during the show that, hey, tonight we're going to do a live extension. So we'll see, not tonight, but there will be some nights this week where we'll do that. And we'll go live with interactive chat over at the YouTube channel. That is an extension of the normal show. So all of that said, thanks for being here. And let's dive into some of these topics I've been talking about. Now, you know me by now. I've talked about Christianity. I've talked about paganism. I've talked about ancient Gnosticism. And we started looking at those things to get an idea of getting a handle on what it is we believe. And I am sometimes even tossed around in that particular category because you might have been raised one way but found that there are things that you study or research or learn that make you want to rethink some of those things and find out, am I really believing the truth or am I believing what was fed to me? And by fed to me, I don't mean that in such an obtuse negative or an overt negative. I mean the things that were fed us, the things we were taught, the things that we were inculcated into. And so, to do a paraphrase of a friend of mine who does radio, I look to uninculcate myself. I want to find out why I need to step back from that, or why I need to believe certain things. And one of the things I was drawn to, of course, was paganism. I wanted to see what that was all about. I am not a pagan. Although there are times in my life I have claimed being a Christian pagan. And even this morning I was digging around for some material, and I found an article on paganism, and I started reading it, and it really funneled down to, at the end, the conclusion was, you cannot be a Christian and be a pagan at the same time. And so I tend to separate with that kind of thinking. I think you can be Christian. You can have a Christianized nature about you. You can have accepted things of the Christian faith, and then find that not everything in that book pertains to you. Not everything is accurate. And you'll find yourself wandering around a bit, trying to think things through. And so I looked into paganism as well. All of that to say, not as a going concern. I'm not out here, we're not stripping naked at Beltane and jumping the Beltane fires, although I'd have a great time watching my wife do that while I drank beer. So I want you to think about these things. And the reason this came up was my wife asked me, now maybe some of you are beyond this stage, maybe you're still in the midst of it, maybe you're thinking about it, but we have kids, and we said, how are we going to raise our kids? What do we want them to believe? And I say, well, do we teach them Christianity? If we don't teach them anything about Christianity, will they have the knowledge to make a choice if that's what they want to choose to believe? Do we teach our kids about paganism? Do we teach our kids something else? What do we want them to be? And even within the Christian faith, do we raise our kids Catholic? Do we raise them Baptist? Do we raise them Pentecostal? Do we raise them Lutheran or Methodist? There's all of those different subcategories in that category if you chose Christianity to pursue. And many of those things don't always jibe with each other either. Within the faith, within the big circle of Christianity, there are all kinds of dots. So you have to eventually ask yourself that question. I think raising children, this is my opinion, and I believe it's backed up by some good psychology. Raising your children believing nothing at all, I think, is irresponsible. You've got to give them some guideposts. You've got to give them a compass to go by. Even if it's atheism, teach your children why. Not just, well, because I don't want to believe in God and all of that's a bunch of nonsense. And to me, that's a nonsense answer. If you are an atheist and you want your children to follow in your footsteps of a belief system, and it is a belief system, by the way, because you're choosing not to believe something else, I would say tell your kids why. Have an intellectual conversation with them. Show an intellectual lifestyle that they can know why you choose to believe the way you believe. And if you want them to appropriate it, give them good reasons why, not just negative strikes against something else. Tell them why you are what you are. And so I think all of this, what I'm getting at is kids need to be raised with a spirituality of sorts. Not even of sorts. Let me knock that off the end. I put that on there to be kind of a softer blow. I think kids need spirituality. No matter what your spirituality is, what you choose it to be, I think your kids need to understand why you have it and why you would wish to pass that on to them, or at least open up the door for them to understand why you believe what you believe, so they have the opportunity to make a choice. Open up those doors. If you're not, let's say you come from, and I use this because it's the easiest in the West, in America. Let's say you were raised in church, and you went to church, and you drifted away from church, and you don't have any big bones against it. You just don't know if you believe it all. You don't really believe anything else. You haven't really gone, and you're just like the typical American who lives life day in and day out, and religion or spirituality doesn't really play a big role for you. Going to church on, I saw somebody say, I think it was Antone, if you're in the chat room tonight, you said something, why doesn't anybody sleep in on Sundays anymore? and you know what the question used to be? How come everybody sleeps in on Sunday rather than going to church anymore? So we've seen paradigm shifts in spirituality or religious practice, even in America. So what's brought that on? If you are one of those people that doesn't have any, I just don't practice it. There's nothing to it. It's no biggie. But if you have kids, what are you bequeathing your children? Are you bequeathing them an ambivalence toward religion or spirituality altogether? Are you giving them any guideposts, any cornerstones on which to build? I know with my own children, they ask me questions about Jesus all the time. There are times when I sing them to sleep at night, in theory, to sleep. When I sing to them at night, I'll play some songs on the guitar and we'll sing songs. And sometimes my son Flynn, a few years ago, when he was a little younger, he's 10 now, he would say, sing me some Jesus songs. And so I'd sing him Jesus songs that I used to sing with the youth group when I was a youth pastor and things like that. And he'd ask questions about them, and I'd answer his questions. Why did he die on the cross? Well, let me tell you about what that's all about, according to Christianity. And I try not to be too technical with them. So kids want to know things. They want to know what else is out there. What if you believe there's nothing else out there? And we're just a product of what we see, and science is the end-all and be-all. Well, teach your kids why, without casting judgment or aspersions on something else. Tell them why you hold to that. Kids need to have a spirituality to hold on to. They need to know what to believe. I remember, this just popped into my head, I don't know who the artist was, and I don't know what the song was, but way back, and I want to say it was at the beginnings of MTV, which was when? In the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And no, it was earlier than that. It was in the 80s, I believe. In the early 80s, early to mid 80s. So I remember seeing a video playing, and it was a guy, he had long blonde hair. He was in a white t-shirt, I think. He was sitting on a stool, playing a song on the guitar, black background all around him. He was spotlit, but there were images coming up behind him of different things that were going on in current events in the world. Devastating things, war, things like that. And I don't remember even the lyrics of the song, but the gist of the message of his song was, I need to have something to believe in, or I have nothing to believe in anymore. Give me something to believe in. And I don't remember where the song wrapped up. I just have that image stuck in my head. And I think this is where kids are when they get into their 20s. If they've been raised with nothing, they are scratching and searching for something, because I believe the soul, the spirit, pushes you to want to know things, just like it did for me when I was a kid. This is part of what we are. And if somebody wants to believe that's all superstitious mumbo-jumbo and that we're looking for things beyond, I think that explain to your kids why that is so. Give them anchors. Don't give them demeaning diatribes about why other people do it and you don't believe it. Tell them why you do it. And so the same in spirituality. We need to raise spiritual children now more than ever. And there's I think there's a little bit of a sense of urgency to tackle spirituality from recent events that have gone on around us. And for many people, spirituality is a taboo topic. It's like religion. It's an irony, since the majority of Americans say they believe in God or a form of God, and they experience frequent feelings of spiritual peace, spiritual well-being, and the number of peer-reviewed publication titles on religion, spirituality, and health research has reached almost 8,000 publications annually. Now, I know none of us read 8,000 books annually, so people are buying those books. People are interested in it. That market would not exist if there were not people clamoring to get it. And so 8,000 books annually on spirituality. And so the sense of urgency to tackle what could be a very sensitive issue stems from, I believe, from recent events, especially the evil perpetrated by neo-Nazism, white supremacy, the mass shootings. Think of Parkland, you think of Santa Fe, you think of other places. The killings of Jews and Muslims in Pittsburgh, in New Zealand. And I believe that now our kids are exposed more due to the internet, which is a good thing, but sometimes our kids have so much more information overload that they have to tackle because it's out there. They see it. They are exposed to it. They ask more questions about it. They probably have more fears about it. And so you've got to ask yourself, am I being a responsible parent by not trying to help my children find a hinge pin spiritually? By spirituality, that's not the same as religion. It's not the same as accepting a certain faith. Spirituality is your children having something to believe in. They believe that there's something deeper. There's the spirit or the soul. There is the afterlife. There are other things. There are other things around them. Teach them about these things. And now more than ever, we have to have a discussion about raising spiritual children. Look at kids that are growing up nowadays. We look at millennials. Millennials take a big kick in the teeth every day, it seems, because they are a product of a generation that started to really drift away from this kind of thing, and they reflect that. So you're seeing a lot of millennials now, as they're growing a little older, are starting to ask these questions and say, I've got to provide answers for my kids. And so we need to raise spiritual kids who have a sense of peacefulness, who have a sense of curiosity, industry, awe, and wonder. I know Carl Sagan said that his parents instilled in him two of the most very valuable things in life. They instilled in him a need for the scientific method and to study things and research from a scientific point of view. But they also instilled in him at the same time a sense of wonder and awe that we don't have the answers to everything. And it's okay to be in awe and wonderment at what is out there. And so children who grow up into adults and who are resilient and optimistic and have a sense of belonging and feel connected to each other are children who were raised by parents who saw the need to teach them about spirituality, about the self, the soul. And what you do with that in faith and religion is something else. That's the next step out from that. It's kind of like when we talked about the ancient mysteries. They would use the not esoteric, the exoteric on the outside to draw people in, the superficial to ask the questions. And once they came in asking, then they would go to the esoteric, the deeper things. And so are religion and spirituality the same thing? It's important to point out that there are some similarities and some differences between the concepts of religion and spirituality. If you're over there in the chat room, tell me what your conceptions are as we start to go into this. Tell me what you think about this. Tell me what you already believe. Tell me what you already do with your kids as we're talking through this. So it's important to point these similarities and differences out. Many people think that they're the same thing. But while spirituality, this comes from the University of Minnesota's Taking Charge of Your Health and Well-Being webpage. They say, while spirituality may incorporate elements of religion, it's generally a broader concept. Religion and spirituality are not the same thing, nor are they entirely distinct from one another. The best way to understand this is to think of two overlapping circles. You've got religion over here, and you've got spirituality over here, and you kind of merge them. And there's this middle ground here where they cross over. And you can look to things. You can go and read books on this. You can pick them up. There are handbooks. There are 8,000 books a year that are published on spirituality. So you can look up some of these questions and try to figure them out. But research on children and spirituality from the book The Spiritual Life of Children. We don't think of children as being spiritual beings, do we? But frankly, I think spirituality is something that we are all born with. And it's something we all want to know more about. And we either nurture that subconscious thing, that innate thing that is born into us, and we seek it out, or we tend to try to shut that down by answering things in a very logical, Spock sort of fashion. We have to have certain scientific answers. But we found that even Spock, in the evolution of that character in Star Trek, found that there was a whole hell of a lot more to the universe than just strict logic. And so Robert Coles, who wrote the book Spiritual Life of Children, The Spiritual Life of Children, he interviewed hundreds of children from all walks of life and religious traditions, including Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hopi, and secular. He reported that what they had to say about God speaks to them and how they listen and react. And he calls his method documentary children's psychology. And he first gets to know the child and then asks a significant question and lets the child speak. And Coles believes the children's stories speak for themselves. Here's 3 examples of what he came up with. He talked to a 10-year-old Hopi girl. Now, Hopi, if you didn't know this, that's an unfamiliar term to you. That's one of the Native American cultures, tribes in the United States, in the Southwest. And the Hopi children, gave the author some memorable thoughts that crossed their minds. So memorable that he, when he recalls these children, he finds himself saying that he began then to have some fairly solid notions about the spiritual life of children. Here's an example. He said, "This is what I eventually heard," and this was back in 1975, so we're talking 40 plus years ago, from a 10-year-old Hopi girl I'd known for almost 2 years. She said, "The sky watches us and listens to us. It talks to us, and it hopes we're ready to talk back. The sky is where the god of the Anglos lives," the teacher told us. She asked where our God lives. I said, "I don't know." I was telling the truth. Our God is the sky and lives wherever the sky is. Our God is the sun and the moon, too. And our God is the Hopi people's hope, if we remember to stay here on consecrated land. That is where we're supposed to be. And if we leave, we lose God. Now, that was a 10-year-old Hopi girl's sense of spirituality. And I'm going to pick up here when we come back, but think about that for a second. She was taught these things, and this is how she saw life, how she saw the universe, and how she saw God. Now, you sit there for 2 minutes. We'll be right back. Hey gang, welcome back from the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com, to listen to the audio and to find all the affiliate networks that this show plays on, as well as terrestrial stations and everywhere else you can find us, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and other places. Also, to all my Intrepids, those who follow this show regularly, and even if you don't and you'd like to, come on over to the simulcast on my YouTube channel, and you can listen to and watch the video version of this show, along with the live chat room, and add your thoughts to the discussion. And this is over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, and Mr., of course, all spelled out. So there you go. Let's get back into this. We were left the first part of this show talking about instilling spirituality in our kids and how important that is. And we were looking at a couple of examples from Robert Cole's The Spiritual Life of Children, when he gave 3 examples of what he learned about children's spirituality. And we talked about the 10-year-old Hopi girl and what she believed. And she ended by saying, this is where we're supposed to be, our land, our place, and if we leave it, we lose God. And this is what she was taught, and this is what she believes. I don't think that was a big negative to her, because she was talking about all the beauty of who God is. And she doesn't want to lose that by leaving the place where she belongs. So some could see a negativity in that she was taught, if you leave here, you're going to lose God. But I think that she saw that from a more positive light. She wanted to be where she was, where her people were, where her people belonged, so that she could experience God the way they believed. He moved on to another example, 10-year-old Carl, he calls him. He says, and Carl made a comment, asked a question, really, that had everyone nodding or smiling in agreement. He asked, how can you know if God is happy or if he isn't happy? If he's sad? And I think that was a pretty good question to ask. That was his spirituality. He was thinking about God. How do you know if God's happy? How do you know if God is sad? Maybe he isn't happy at all. And boy, you look at the Old Testament, you didn't see much about a happy God. God was supposed to have all these attributes that made him so much like us. It's interesting to me, as a side note here, that in the writing of the Old Testament, the writing of the New Testament, we find that there are all these human attributes that God could have if you don't do the right thing or the way he prescribed. You don't see God being a happy God, sitting back and laughing with his people, instilling joy and happiness. What did he say? He said, joy and happiness only comes by the way you worship me, by the way you follow my dictates and my mandates. That's the overall message we tend to get. What we saw of God's attributes was anger and wrath and all the things that would happen because we as human beings with finite minds that are not infinite like God's violated his laws and his precepts, which were only given to us by people who rose up and said they were prophets of his. And so, we just saw a prophet of extremist radical Islam killed over the last couple of weeks. You can see what prophets do to a people. So the question is, let me ask you, type it in the chat room. Don't go look anything up. This is a snap quiz. I want to see what comes out of your head. Tell me one time that you read in Scripture where God is happy and he's joyful and he rejoices happily with his people, no matter what they do. There's your challenge. We'll come back to that. There was a third thing that Coles wrote about with children's spirituality. Betsy, when asked to draw a picture of God, most children who draw God's face more than once, or that of Jesus, repeat more or less the same thing over and over again. And the same proportion to the features, the same use of colors, the same overall shape. Not Betsy. She once colored God's face brown and told me that if she were black, as some of her classmates are, she'd want to draw God's face that way all of the time. But a second thought took this experience, or this expressive form. I'd want to make him white some of the time because he's white as well as black, don't you think? And to that question, the author answered yes to her, which I think that's a whole nother question. Is there a black Santa Claus? Well, in the black community, yes. Is Jesus black? To the black community, yes. To me, a historian, I would say, well, Jesus wasn't black and he wasn't white either. He was Semitic. He was an Israelite. He was more or less olive-skinned, as you can see most Middle Eastern Israelites would have been. And think of Arabic peoples, same blood stock. And so genetic stock, I should say. And so Jesus was neither white nor black. But we depict God and Jesus the way he works for us. It's interesting. It's interesting that the Apostle Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, whether you think he hijacked Christianity or not, he wrote this, and he said, to the Jew I am become a Jew, to the Greek I am become a Greek, in order that I might win some people over to God. He's saying, I become what I have to become to win people over. Now, for good or ill, maybe that's the way God is. God isn't white or black. There's a good racial question for you. Now, how about spirituality in teens and their health? There's a Dr. Lisa Miller who reported that children who have an active, positive relationship to spirituality also have these things. 40% less likely to use and abuse substances. Now, I'm not talking about trying a cigarette or pot or beer or the things that kids tend to do in high school when they're stupid teenagers. But I am talking about things that lead to abusive things. Kids who grow up with spirituality at the core are 40% less likely to use and abuse substances. They are 60% less likely to be depressed as teenagers. Look at all the teen suicide out there. And by the way, on Wednesday of this week, Rocky and I are going to have a guest who's a friend of mine. She wrote the book, if you remember a few years ago, I put this out. She wrote the book, The Day After Tomorrow, and it was about teen suicides. Now, she happens to also be a psychic medium, and she claims that she was plagued by these children who would come to her in the night, teens, who had passed on because they committed. So I'm getting chills that goes up the back of my arms just talking about it. They would come to her, and I remember her telling me her story, and I edited her book and laid her book out and designed her book cover. That's why I got very close to the story. I read through her entire book 2 or 3 times in an editing process. And these kids would come to her and want to talk to her and urged her to write a book about them. And she didn't know what the purpose of the book would be. Was it going to hit the New York Times bestsellers list, or was it going to be efficacious for a handful of people? All she knew was she had to write these stories out, which she did. But kids, that made me think of that. Kids who have a spirituality, and we're not talking just a form of spirituality. If you remember me saying when I was a youth pastor, I once asked the kids in my youth group, why are you a Christian? Why are you a Christian? And many of those kids couldn't give me a cogent answer. Well, because my parents are Christians. Well, because we've always gone to this church. Because of this or that. And none of them really hit on because it's something I've personally appropriated. It's something I understand and want to grow in knowledge of. Kids don't talk that way. And most kids don't think that way. So kids who have a spirituality that is genuine, they tend to be 40% less likely to abuse substances. They tend to be 60% less likely to be depressed. And depression, of course, as we know, has led many kids to teen suicide. So 80% less likely to have dangerous or unprotected sex and have positive markers for thriving, including an increased sense of meaning and purpose, high levels of academic success. 80% of kids are less likely to have those things of danger, less likely to have dangerous and unprotected sex, but more likely to have all those positive things, an increased sense of meaning for who they are. I know I had a spirituality as a teen. It was very wrapped up in my religion, which was fundamental conservative Baptist theology, but I had a sense of purpose and meaning. And so I had a higher level of academic success when I applied myself. I was the kind of kid who in school I could get a C- on a test if I didn't do anything other than just recall. If I didn't study, didn't read the syllabus, didn't take notes very well, I could pull off a C- because I had a good memory for things and a comprehension. If I had ever applied myself, I'd have probably been a 4.0 student. So, oh, and by the way, just as an aside, we were talking about something online today, or over the weekend, in some post about the current impeachment process and all of that. And somebody said of me, not directly to me, well, will somebody please inform Scotty Roberts that blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, I'm in the room. Why don't you inform me? And then he, backpedaled a little bit. I didn't mean it as an insult, but, maybe you need to know this and that. And I said, you know what? I said, I would just disagree with you fundamentally. And I added this. I said, and by the way, I self-identify as a very well-informed person. So at least we've got that going for us. So kids are 80% more likely to be academically successful and have a better sense of thriving, having positive markers, having meaning to their life, if they have a spirituality. Other researchers found these things, that high school students who reported turning to spiritual beliefs when experiencing problems were less likely to use substances as a salve to cover up the pain, to cover up and to cope with things. Spiritual children and adolescents who are depressed have fewer thoughts of suicide and suicide attempts. Childhood overindulgence leads to diminished spirituality. That's overindulging in food, overindulging in abusive substances, addictive substances. That tends to lead to a diminished spirituality. Now, there's connections between childhood overindulgence, materialism, and diminished spirituality. Diminished spirituality. One of the root causes of a diminished spirituality is its connection to childhood overindulgence. A second factor is excessive materialism, wanting things, needing things, fighting to gain things. The following studies demonstrate this. In the first study, it's found that individuals who are overindulged as children were more likely to grow up wanting the most money, owning the most expensive possessions, not interested in meaningful relationships, not interested in meaningful life, not interested in making society better unless they got something out of it. That's overindulgence as well. Kids who were not overindulging but were being overindulged. Spoiled kids. Kids that run the roost because we don't keep control of them. They always grew up wanting more money, to own more possessions, not interested in meaningful relationships, not interested in a meaningful life, not interested in making society better unless it suited them. In a second study, it was found that children who were overindulged grew up to be adults who lacked self-control, were more materialistic, were unappreciative, ungrateful, and were less happy than those that were not overindulged. In a third study, it was found that adults who were overindulged as children grow up feeling entitled to more of everything that they think they deserve. They were not interested in spiritual growth. They have difficulties finding meaning in times of hardship, and they're less apt to develop a personal relationship with a power greater than themselves. And other researchers found that there is substantial evidence showing that people who are materialistic, consume more products, and incur more debt have a lower quality interpersonal relationship with anybody. They act in more ecologically destructive ways. They have adverse work and educational motivation, and they report lower personal and physical well-being. Do you know people like that? Now dig deep. Would you classify yourself as any of those things? And if you do, what would you say is the level of your personal spirituality? How do you believe you were raised? Were you raised given things, or you had more allowance, or you were overindulged, or you were allowed to have your way all the time, even if there wasn't a lot of material things? Did you grow up into somebody that... Do you have problems with interpersonal relationships? Do you have adverse work and educational motivations? Do you have a lower personal and physical well-being? Maybe all of those things are linked to the overindulgence as opposed to instilling of spirituality. And it's something that's important, I think, to look into. And look at how you're raising your kids now. If you were raised not developing or nurturing your own self-spirituality, you're probably not doing it for your kids either, unless you've had some magical epiphany, some lightning strike out of the sky that made you say, hey, I got to do this. But if you haven't done that, maybe it's time to think about that. How do you raise your kids? Now, if your kids are grown and out of the house, you don't have that ability anymore. But what you do have the ability to do is focus on your own spirituality. Where are you? Maybe some of you have got this handled really well, and you are models to look to for this. I've always hoped that someday I would become that man on the mountain. In my elder years, where people would come to me because they saw me as a role model of somebody who appropriated spirituality and had a sense of being able to pass that on. Do you have that? What do you do with, let's get it more down and dirty. What do you do with your struggles in life? What do you do when times are hard? I always say that spirituality perks up and shows its true colors when you're in the midst of crisis, when you're in the midst of problems. I know when I had my open heart surgery, almost 3 years ago now, I had a series of heart attacks that I didn't know I was having. I had symptoms that made me think, it's my rotator cuff issue or something like that. And I finally drugged myself into the ER, and the next day, the same night, they put stents in, and the next day they opened up my chest and did heart surgery. And so through all of that, there's the potential of dying. And you look back and you go, what if I had died? And I remember doing a little YouTube video, not YouTube, it was Facebook Live. I rambled for about 25 minutes, 2 weeks after the surgery. And I think I was wearing this sweater, as a matter of fact. And I was sitting and I just talked about how I felt about things. And how I said I didn't feel a foxhole conversion coming on when I thought, what if I die on the operating table? I seemed to have full trust and faith in the doctors and that it would come out okay. I didn't think I might die through this. It didn't even occur to me. I just said, okay, let's go, I guess. And I went in and I came out of that saying, it didn't change my view of God. What it deepened for me was the way I loved and cared about the people around me. And so that deepened my spirituality in a sense. And that wanes a little bit sometimes when you get further away from the event. But for me, it's pretty much stayed a constant. You get wrapped up in daily things, but what is your spiritual core is what I'm asking. And how are you passing that on to your kids, or how have you passed that on to your kids, or how can you improve that? So now I'm going to talk a little bit for the last few minutes we have today about some specific things as a parent that you can do strategies that you can use to raise a spiritual child. And only you will know the answer to this. Is your child struggling with difficult questions and experiences? Maybe they just have typical questions and experiences. So as a parent, do you want your child to grow up and be resilient? Meaning they bounce back from things. They go, okay, this happened, but here we are. We got life. Do you want your child to have a sense of awe and a deep sense of empathy for other people, for animals and other people? Look at the way a kid treats an animal, they say, and you'll see what he's got going on inside. Do you want your teenager to not use drugs or engage in unprotected sex or to be depressed? We already know none of us want those things for our kids. Do you want your child to be optimistic and have a sense of belonging and a sense of peacefulness about them? I'm not talking about, a child that walks around almost with a halo and their peacefulness. No, a child that has a sense of where they are and who they are and the peacefulness that's underneath it all. Do you want to instill that in your kids? Do you want your children to be self-controlled, to be grateful, to be happy? I want my kids to be happy. I got my son, Flynn. We love this child. I love this child to death. He is always growling and gristling, and he's 10 years old, and I'm like, where did my happy little son go? And I always wonder, and I'm concerned, why does he seem so unhappy at times? And then other times he's the total opposite. So there are some deep questions. We do have him, once every few weeks going to see a counselor just to be able to talk about his stuff that he doesn't want to talk to mom and dad about. And we don't know a whole lot about it. She reports if there's anything we need to know, but just a time for him to get things out. I want him to be happy. And I want him to be grateful. I want to know what I can do to make that better as a parent. I'm very concerned that my child is a happy child and grows up happy. And happiness doesn't mean your whole life is always filled with joy and happiness and skipping and jumping. It means that when the bad things happen, the dirty things, the things that get us down, what do you go to pull yourself back up and out? I know I had my own daughters, my twin daughters, who are very self-sufficient, would many times over the years call me up crying or have something that they wanted to talk about, just to find that cornerstone again, to find that snippet of foundation. I raised them to be happy children, to be happy adults. And sometimes all they needed to do was touch base, and then they moved on and they got into it, and they're happy people. They know how to look for happiness a bit deeper than the surface issues. We all want that for our kids. Do you want your teenagers interested in making society a better place, even though they don't get anything in return? Remember when I mentioned last week at some point along the way, when I was a youth pastor, I taught a whole series to the kids on how to be a servant. Because I said Christianity isn't always about what you get out of it. It's about what you give. And so I taught them, what do we do to be a servant? And I said, sometimes being a servant means you go out and you do things, you get your fingernails dirty, and nobody knows about it. Nobody sees it. It's not for self-adulation. It's for doing the right things. It's for doing things sometimes without getting any notice or return for it. It's the satisfaction of knowing that you're making society a better place. Consider raising a spiritual child. And I can also see by the clock we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm not going to get through this. We'll pick this up tomorrow, but let me get at least a roll into it here. Spirituality is an inner sense of relationship to a higher power that's loving and guiding. The word we give to this higher power might be God. It might be nature. It might be spirit. It might be the universe, the creator, or other words that represent a divine presence. But the important point is that spirituality encompasses our relationship and dialogue with this higher presence. And that's for us personally, and we use that to encourage our own children's spirituality. there's certain things you have to avoid, and I've got a whole list of things that I think we're not going to have time to get into. So we'll start that tomorrow. How to encourage your child's spirituality and in turn appropriate that yourself. Do you have those tools? It doesn't mean you never get pissed off. It doesn't mean you never get angry. It doesn't mean you never act in ways that are inappropriate. What it means is that you're always drawn back to what you should be, what you ought to be inside, because you've developed that in yourself. And this is who you are. You're a spiritual being who has nurtured your own spiritual being. And then, of course, as you're doing it, or because you've done it, or even in the process of doing it, you can pass that on to your children if you have children that are in need of that. And all children are in need of that. What I meant by that, if you have children that age, it's not too late to start. And it's not too late to incorporate into yourself. Folks, thanks for being here. We got to cut out now for about 23 hours, but we'll be back. So you sit tight and hang on. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.